All right. Kuhn thought that a basic set of ethical commitments were already known to us. And I think that we've seen that in the ideas that you've advanced, although clearly people routinely ignore those commitments. He was convinced that indeed from the dawn of time, those commitments have been understood or known or intuited by human beings, because who doesn't want to live a life free of chaos and fear and violence and brutal coercion? Many people who engage in interfaith dialogue want to leave space for others whose religious and cultural norms are different from their own. Many people believe that respecting religions and cultures means respecting their teachings and practices. But I also expect that you will agree that oppressed people have always wanted a say in their affairs. Women have always wanted power over their own lives. Children have always wanted to be able to play and learn and discover, and that this is true across religious differences. So that's why Kuhn was certain that over the past thousands of years, ethical demands that express these teachings had been integrated, or at least in some implicit form, into religious and non-religious texts, teachings, rituals, and moral codes. So this is a quote from the Global Ethic, which summarizes basically what I've just said, which is what Kuhn realized after the end of a long study and research into the different religions of the world and engagement from practitioners of those religious traditions. So I do want to talk about why global ethic if we already have the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. There is some difference, a distinction between rights and a moral code. So the short answer is that the global ethic and human rights don't necessarily cover the same spheres of life. Human rights are enforced by laws, by treaties, by governments and various institutional stakeholders, whereas an ethic or an ethos, a moral way of life, operates at a more personal level and is often not regulated or may not be regulated by laws at all. An ethic is primarily concerned with our relationship with other people and our inner lives or consciousness, our consciousness, our attitudes, most of which is beyond the reach of laws and treaties. So a few questions to help us assess the difference between moral principles and human rights. So I just came up with the example of if a friend invites me for dinner and I lie to my friend about having plans for dinner as a way to not have dinner with that friend for whatever reason, does that violate a human right? I think we would agree that it does not. So that's where I'm trying to get to, is that moral principles and the global ethic address areas of relationships between people that may not be related to the kinds of rights that are regulated by laws and state actors. That doesn't, so I would not be arrested, for example, for telling my friend a fib. My conscience may bother me, and hopefully it does, especially if this is we won't need to talk about the circumstances, but I would not be arrested for telling my friend a fib, whereas there are principles that are enforced by laws. So we see that the global ethic is covering an area of relationship between people that's not regulated in other ways. And I think that it'll be important to think about how moral principles and human rights work to support each other, because it was Kuhn's intention that this global ethic would actually help to support the UN's Declaration of Human Rights, and that they would work in tandem together. Um, the global ethic came about because Kuhn was calling for one. And leaders of the parliament of the world's religions, as they were working to begin to organize the 1993 parliament, attended his lecture at the University of Chicago, in which he called for this global ethic. And they were very taken with his call for this document that would put in one place the shared values and commitments held in common by the world's religious and non-religious people. So they asked him to please write the global ethic. He actually was initially reluctant. It wasn't his intention to write the ethic. It was his intention simply to call for one. But he decided to go about doing this work. And the intention on the side of the leaders of the parliament was to unveil and to present all the attendees at the 1993 parliament this document. So as Kuhn sat down to develop the parameters for the global ethic, he decided that he could not duplicate the Declaration on Human Rights, since, as we've talked about, an ethos is different from right. He decided that the global ethic had to focus on a deep moral level rather than something that was regulated on the superficial level of laws. It must be capable of winning buy-in from the world's religions. It must be self-critical, and it must be reflect reality, or what is already the case. It must be stated in ordinary language so that it could be accessible to anyone who wished to read it. And it must have a religious foundation, although it could not contain any explicit religious language in order to be inclusive of all the world's religious, spiritual, and secular traditions. So then Kuhn, having established these parameters, reached out to his vast network of scholars and religious leaders from various religions and regions of the world to ask for their input. And so earlier you saw me mention that over 200 religious leaders and scholars participated in the writing of the global ethic. And that's because Kuhn reached out to about 100 or so of his colleagues, and then the leaders of the parliament reached out to their own very extensive network of religious leaders and scholars. And so all told, about 200 of these experts weighed in and helped shape and frame the global ethic. So what does it say? Having had this long preamble. So there are 5 moral principles, or directives as they are called, in the global ethic. And you'll see already just from the succinct cases that you mentioned earlier. So a commitment to a culture of nonviolence and respect for life, commitment to a culture of solidarity and a just economic order, commitment to a culture of tolerance and a life of truthfulness, commitment to a culture of equal rights and partnership between men and women, commitment to a culture of sustainability and care for the earth, which was a commitment directive added in 2018, which is my contribution to the global ethic. Well, you'll note that the language of the global ethic uses commitment to culture, and here we see the strong reflection of Kuhn's decision for this to be an ethos or a way of life. So he's talking about a commitment to a culture. So these commitments are very bold and beautiful, but need more detail. Otherwise, they can sound like empty platitudes. But of course, Kuhn did set out to give flesh to these commitments. And so the global ethic document itself is rather more lengthy. So let's look at a quote from the first directive, the directive, which is a commitment to a culture of nonviolence and respect for life. So there's language that elaborates this directive, and you are seeing part of that here on your screens. I'll just let you read that for yourselves.
The Parliament launched a project to identify and set down the ethical commitments held in common by the world's religious, spiritual, and cultural traditions. Tonight, the Parliament reaffirms its commitment to the global ethic, and we invite you to do the same. Numberless women and men of all regions and religions strive to lead lives not determined by egoism, but by commitment to their fellow humans and to the world around them. Nevertheless, all over the world we find endless hatred, envy, jealousy, and violence. In the great ancient religious and ethical traditions of humankind, we hear the directive, "You shall not kill," or "Have respect for life." Conflicts should be resolved without violence, within a framework of justice. There is no survival for humanity without global peace. A human person is infinitely precious and must be unconditionally protected. But likewise, the lives of animals and plants which inhabit this planet with us deserve protection, preservation, and care. Limitless exploitation of the natural foundations of life, ruthless destruction of the biosphere, and militarization of the cosmos are all outrages. We must cultivate living in harmony with nature and the cosmos. Every people, every race, every religion must show tolerance and respect, indeed, high appreciation for every other. We invite all people, whether religious or not, to do the same.
So here's another quote from the global ethic. And this addresses the notion that the global ethic, while its language expresses the shared commitments of the world's religious and non-religious people, that it is not trying to in some way create one religion by bringing religious actors together. It is intended to be a document that serves as a captures what they share, but of course each community of faith is formulating those principles in their very specific way. So above all, we urge the various communities of faith to formulate their very specific ethic. What does each faith tradition have to say, for example, about the meaning of life and death, the enduring of suffering and the forgiveness of guilt, about selfless sacrifice and the necessity of renunciation, about compassion and joy? These will deepen and make more specific the already